Well, hey everyone, Calais with my ALF Training, and today I'm really excited. This is our first webinar we're doing. We have a nurse instructor. Her name is Diane Barnard. Is that your last name, Barnard?
Yes.
And, Diane's got a very big resume, and I don't have a very big memory, so I'm going to let Diane go ahead and tell our students here, well, your background, a little bit about yourself.
All right. I don't know if it's a big resume, but it's a long one because I've been doing it a long time. So I think that I am bringing to this webinar diverse experience with a lot of different people. And I've worked with kids, adults, long-term care, home health, and I'm also a board certified psychiatric nurse. So I have worked with a lot of people who are in distress. And I also am a board certified holistic nurse. So I've run the gamut. As he said, I have been a nursing instructor. I've worked ICU. I've worked with all kinds of health conditions, but I'm primarily a psychiatric nurse.
Okay. Well, today we're going to talk about human trafficking and in healthcare, right? That's your subject. And then we're going to tie it in with long-term care.
Yes.
So I'm going to share Diane's PowerPoint that she made. So let me go and share. Hopefully it works fine without any hiccups. Okay. All right. Are you all seeing this? It looks like, yep.
Yes. So if we can bump up to the first slide.
Yeah, let me see if I can. I'm trying to move this over a little bit. How about, whoops. Our faces are here. Maybe I'll move that up. Okay. Okay. Go ahead, Diane.
Okay. So I think that the subject of human trafficking is a dynamic, it's a fluid conversation. There are some things that it will always be, there's some things that are very solid about it, but I think that as healthcare providers, we have to continue the conversation on how to be better and do better in identifying human trafficking victims, also improving our cultural sensitivity, how we deal with those people, and how we can add value to their lives. So I would like to consider this a conversation and also an instruction and to provide some value to the participants and that they may be better providers for this.
And be aware of,
yes,
you know, that you will come across or may come across human trafficking victims.
Yeah, I have some slides on the demographics, and it's surprising how many, or even the classifications, there were some that I was not aware of. And Rob, how many people, who it involves, and it's pretty compelling, the numbers. We can skip to the next slide.
Okay.
So the objectives that I would like to achieve for today is to define human trafficking in a way that most people can understand in a usable way for your practice, and also to identify the most common types of human trafficking encountered by healthcare professionals, which really, if you think about it, healthcare professionals are really the first line of, they're the front line, and they're the ones probably most likely to see people who are in these positions. And I think one common theme of human trafficking victims are that they're not yelling, help me, or I'm a trafficked victim. So you have to be astute, you have to be aware, you have to know how to ask the right questions. And so that's one of the goals for this webinar as well.
Similar to like abuse, like if somebody you suspected was abused, whether, you know, somebody coming in with bruises or those type of things, but this is a whole nother category.
Right. So, and explain the role of the professional caregiver in identifying and responding to the needs of human trafficking victims. And of course, everyone would say, well, our role is to help. But I think that the difference with human trafficking victims is that they won't always accept help. So I would like to give someone at least a little toolbox of what their resources are in helping people that don't want help, at least the very minimum that you can do. And to identify action steps the individual, the healthcare organization, and the community can take to address human trafficking, because it is, it's global, it's domestic, and it really requires all hands on deck. I did put in to address current human trafficking concerns regarding the current crisis. And of course, this is dynamic and a fluid and ever-changing situation. But I think at the very minimum, I would imagine that maybe these people would be accessing healthcare more often in a pandemic. So it's an opportunity to maybe perhaps recognize and get them help. Cause other concerns.
Yeah, more people may be seeking healthcare during an outbreak of.
Yeah, I think so. I think so.
Might not otherwise.
Yeah, we don't know really how it will play out, but I think that knowing that this pandemic is impacting every part of society at every level, that it will impact human trafficking as well. So just be aware of that.
All right, next slide.
Yeah.
Okay.
So just a little bit of the statistics, and I tried to reference evidence-based statistics through legitimate sites. So all these statistics that I have are from either the International Labor Organization. I tried to get the most current and up to date. And so there's 40.3 million victims at any given time in 2016. That was the last stat that I could find. So you could imagine it's probably more. We will go through the different types of human trafficking, and it's basically two categories: labor trafficking and sex worker trafficking. And 90% of the sex trafficking victims were women and children. And these numbers are considered to be low due to underreporting.
Right.
And
these are just estimates almost.
It is insane. I didn't realize, I actually did not realize when I started my research how almost pandemic it is.
Mm-hmm.
The International Labor Organization of the United Nations, they update the worldwide statistics, and that's where I got this information.
Wow. Yeah, it's scary.
It is scary.
Okay, you want to go to the next slide?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
I should have given you the control, you know, when we're watching. I'm just here for mild commentary. Okay.
Yeah. So this here, I just put this in here just so I think that people need to recognize that human trafficking is considered both a public health and a criminal justice issue. It has significant ties to organized crime. And there are some things like the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 that are in place. And there was a Palermo Convention, and people don't really need to recognize all of the details of that, but recognize that the society in general has been taking proactive steps to mitigate this global issue. Not successfully, obviously, if there's that many people that are being trafficked, but there are some things and safeguards in place. The Palermo Convention being one of them. And they have they break it down into 3 different protocols. And people can review that. We're just doing the human trafficking for now.
Right.
So,
okay.
On to the next one. So, in short, even though there's not a clearly unified global definition for human trafficking, there is one thing that everyone can agree on, and that is human trafficking is modern day slavery. And it has 3 parts: act, means, and purpose. And so that means that there's an action. So a perpetrator takes an action to take somebody. There's a means. They either have coerced or forced them to do something, and they have taken the individual for the purpose of either forced labor or sexual labor. So it differs. The reason why you make that distinction is because there are some people that are smuggled, but when they get to the other side or they've paid their whatever they've done, they are free wherever they've gone. So there has to be, for it to be human trafficking, there has to be an action from a perpetrator that was forced, a means to do it, and a purpose for them taking the individual. So it does differ from smuggling.
Okay.
So the 3 categories for human trafficking is the 2 that I've mentioned before, which are for sex workers, the forced labor, and then domestic servitude. And I think that when we move forward into, as we move through this webinar, if we were trying to pull in how this may impact long-term care, it would probably be more likely the 3rd category.
Yeah, forced labor and
Yes.
domestic. Yeah, but yeah, in long-term care.
Yeah.
But in healthcare, recognizing the sexual exploitation.
I do have later on in the slides some things that healthcare workers, and any healthcare worker, just not a nurse, just not somebody in a pristine white coat in some type of clinic, but anyone that works with people in crisis, whether they're aides or someone that is working with anyone in a medical way, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about healthcare workers. They could be nurses' aides, they could be dietitians, they could be someone pushing the dietary cart, someone that interfaces regularly with people that are in need, in that type of working capacity. That's what we're talking about. And we all may interface with someone.
Right. Okay. Persons most at risk for exploitation. I'll just read. Are you gonna? You can go ahead. Runaways. That's one.
Yeah. So what we talk about, if you think about when you're looking at any of these that are listed, there's a certain vulnerability associated. These people, most of them are vulnerable. Runaways, homeless, orphaned adolescents, they're more likely to be exploited. They're more likely to maybe fall for somebody. And we can go later on and talk about some ways that people exploit others or get them or groom them or coach them to maybe trust them. Because really, most people aren't just getting into a car with someone that looks like someone that's going to do you harm. They really probably go with people that they think are going to help them or trust them. Some people, of course, are abducted off the street, but other people are groomed and actually tricked into going along with something. And these people, runaways, homeless, foreign nationals, individuals with histories of trauma or violence, females, they may be vulnerable, just that might not apply, but they're more likely to be exploited.
Well, 90%, one of the statistics were women and children, so.
Right, but I was thinking as being vulnerable. I didn't want to lay, just
Oh,
because.
right. No, right.
Yeah. Now, as far as lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgendered individuals, I do think that even though we've come a long way in our society, a lot of times people do feel disenfranchised. They don't, it depends on where they are. And they're not all coming from the United States. They could be coming from different cultures. They are often at risk for exploitation of all kinds. Psychological or emotional vulnerability. These are people that may be more likely to be groomed by somebody. Economic hardship. Lots of people are tricked into thinking that they're going to get a good job somewhere. And they're saying, oh, you can come here, and they go, and that's not what happens. Lack of a social safety net. Of course, anybody that's doesn't have a background in protective factors of family or friends looking out for them are more likely to go missing or be victimized and not hit the radar right away. Natural disasters, political instability, and I got these statistics from the Institute of Medicine, from the 2014 statistics.
Right. Myths and misconceptions.
Yeah, so I think that when we went back, a lot of people think, I think it's a misconception that people think that human trafficking victims aren't your neighbor, and it's not on their radar. And one of our goals is to put human trafficking on people's radar or in their line of vision as a possibility for when they see someone. And so if you have in your mind that a human trafficking victim doesn't speak English, or perhaps is
Yeah, they don't fit the stereotypical.
correct.
Yeah.
And so or they're poor, or that you have whatever that is that you think that you boxed in your vision, that needs to expand, because they're all races, genders, socioeconomic statuses. On human trafficking, the other thing would like people to leave this webinar with the concept that human trafficking isn't just sexual trafficking, it's forced labor and domestic servitude. And I think that that's one thing that people aren't thinking of. They think human trafficking, sex worker. And there's a lot of people that are working in sweatshops, massage parlors, agriculture, restaurants, hotels, domestic service that are forced labor. And we need to be aware of that.
Mm-hmm.
And the only caveat is that any sex act with a child who is induced to perform sex acts who is under 18 is a crime, whether forced or not. It's a federal crime.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of, when you think about, of course it's a crime, but like, let's say there's a 17-year-old working the street or whatever that had run away, almost an adult. That's still, it's the 18. That's very, very important. Whether she chooses to do it or not, that would still be against the law.
We're still trafficking, yeah.
I guess if they're being managed, maybe not if she was doing it on her own, but very few people live in that environment without protection of like somebody else.
Right. Right. Let's go on.
So another myth, I think I already addressed this, that human trafficking is the same as smuggling. It's different. And human trafficking does not have to cross borders. Smuggling does. When you smuggle somebody in, you're in essence crossing a border illegally. And it violates immigration laws. And human trafficking can be domestic. It's actually a big problem domestic. And so that's something that I think that needs to...
Yeah, myth would be that it's all immigrants or smuggling.
Right. And also a myth is that the human trafficking victim will seek help when given a chance. And that's not true. They won't. Remember, they already started from the platform of being vulnerable, maybe broken, maybe with psychological issues, very disenfranchised, fearful, running away from maybe a terrible situation. So they're not always going to raise their hand and yell, "Help me." So that's where healthcare really has to be on their toes and supportive, open, and helpful to these people. And they may fear retribution. They may have been threatened by there's always a manager. There's always somebody supervising them. They could have their families threatened. They may not have any documents. They may fear deportation.
Could be family. Could be family, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So, and the other thing is, I think we learned, if anybody remembers way back, when they talked about the Stockholm Syndrome, remember when people who were abducted then became sympathetic to their abductors?
Mm-hmm.
who was the Patty Hearst way back in the day when she was kidnapped? Everybody had talked about that. But that is a true thing that when people begin to have empathy or, now I don't think it happens all the time in human trafficking, but I think that as professional caregivers, we need to understand that vulnerable people bond to the people that are caring for them. And it doesn't mean that it has to be a loving care. It could be, I am dependent on you for food, going to the bathroom. I am literally dependent on you for everything. And so it's terrifying for them to just say, okay, I'm done with this, because that's what they're used to.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking of, the Stockholm syndrome myself. So, human trafficking as a public health problem.
Yes. So, I mean, it is a public health problem because a lot of the times, obviously, if the person is trafficked, stolen from their lives, put into servitude of some kind, they're not coming with health insurance, and they're not seeking they're not seeking routine maintenance, they're not getting dental work done, they're not doing anything. Usually they hit the healthcare system when it's almost crisis level, when something, broken bones, bleeding, abortion, pregnancy, something that can't be managed by the traffickers. So they don't get regular routine care, and often don't have health insurance. So it is a public health concern, because ultimately when they do enter the health system, it takes resources, of course, because they demand more. They are in more critical need of care when they get there. So a lot of mental health issues, depression, anxiety, social isolation, a lot of communicable diseases, and a lot of just general hygiene issues, overcrowded, poor sanitation. So with the mental health concerns, suicidal ideation, trying to escape their plight, self-harming, such as cutting, certainly PTSD, dental problems I had mentioned, they don't get routine dental care, broken bones from abuse, they sometimes present with battery, general trauma, pregnancy and abortion, failed abortions. Sometimes they are forced to have abortions, but not under medical care. So these are some of just a few of the things. And of course, every human being can have the same thing as any other human being. So they are as likely to get the cold, flu, fever, everything else that we will all get as well. But these are some things that compound the issue, and are frequently seen. So when we're screening people and we're looking at people and they're having a lot of these things, we should not rule out the possibility, or maybe we should ask the next question, like, hey, where are you from? Where are you going? I'm going to go through later some of the questions and how you ask questions.
Yeah.
But when you see any of these things, or particularly a combination, it should be a red flag and a call to action for you to ask the next question. Like, is this person safe? So just some more. Substance abuse is rampant. Sleep issues, of course, they're kind of tying into poor hygiene, crowded living conditions, hyper awareness, fear. Malnutrition is often an issue. HIV, and I don't know why I don't have it in there, but any of the communicable things such as hepatitis, abuse such as cigarette burns. Like, you'll see a lot of.
Got it right now.
What's that?
We'll add it in here.
Oh, okay. Any type of STD, and the hepatitis. And I would also say tuberculosis, even though for the most part you don't see it as much. I think that you do see tuberculosis in populations that are also immunocompromised with things like HIV. So that would also be something that I would look for, even though it's not it's becoming more of a problem in the general population. At one time it was not, but it particularly is a concern with people who are immunocompromised.
Mhm.
Stress will make you, stress will help you get sicker quicker.
Yeah. Public
So,
health. Yeah, go ahead, Diane.
okay, so as far as what we should do for public health, and anybody, like anyone that's taking this webinar, really is somewhere working somewhere in the public sector in health. And so what we should focus on is prevention, of course. And so there are so many things, so many programs out there that work on prevention. Part of prevention for us as healthcare providers would be to be aware, to help educate people on, I don't know if we could educate a lot on people that are just kidnapping people from other countries. We can certainly educate that in numbers and demographics. But when we're talking about prevention and education and what we can do on the first ripple, what I can do in my environment, in my practice, is basically learn like how some kids are groomed online, maybe incorporate that into regular teaching in a pediatric office, like really improve our awareness as a society that this happens. It happens frequently, and it could happen to your kid, your neighbor's kid, as well as the child in Colombia. I think it's a global and domestic health issue, and if that's the only thing that we could convey to people, we would be successful in thinking, it's here, it's a problem, and I could be part of the solution. So the other thing that we could do, the prevention, the intervention in mitigating the effect and impact of human trafficking. And to mitigate is to moderate or to try to make less. So we can't stop it, but maybe we can lessen the effect. So as healthcare providers, we work on identification, we work on our own cultural biases, like we expand our awareness, and we're like saying, asking the next question, we're learning how to interview someone. You're not going to walk into somebody with their manager or whatever they call them and say, hey, you're just not going to do that. You're going to try to separate them. You're going to recognize their fear. You're going to ask questions that will give you an answer, not maybe an open-ended question. There are things that you can do to elicit a response and give you more information. One of the things that you can do is to make sure that these kids or adults get their vaccinations to help lessen communicable diseases, and also the management of chronic problems such as high blood pressure and diabetes, which is a common problem in any population, but particularly with ones that don't receive care. Because if you think about the implication of not managing your high blood pressure or diabetes, stroke later on. So this is, I guess that's another thing, which would be when we're talking about long-term care, human trafficking. If we went back to that first slide, don't go back, but when we put that first law out, that was the year 2000. It's now 2020. So let's say that there was a trafficking victim that was 45 in domestic servitude back in 2000. She could, or he could legitimately be in long-term care now, complete with still they may be safe from that trafficker, or they may be somewhere, but they might still present with issues that we need to be aware of: depression, isolation, lack of trust, that kind of thing. So it's unrealistic to think that.
And when we talk about long-term care in our industry is even 18 years old.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's we have as young as 18 can live in an assisted living facility, and some of them government-funded type programs. And
that website that we were reviewing together beforehand had mentioned that was also one of the places where they were at risk for human trafficking as well. That was an interesting point.
Yeah, we'll cover that, but I won't.
Okay.
Right, and I know immunizations or neglect to take care of chronic problems, but could be a flag if somebody hasn't been immunized at all.
Right.
Maybe they, I know that.
Or didn't have records, because I'm sure they'll have it, but I lost my records. I think that that's another thing. I do have a slide later on. Some of the objective signs, I guess you could say objective, which is like the subjective, that they look depressed, or they sad, and they're not talking. But some of the things that are red flags are lack of records that they should have. I mean, in this world of electronic medical records, there's a paper trail, and when there isn't, that really should be a big red flag. Maybe not so much years ago, but since everything is, electronic, they should have some type of documented medical care that follows them, and if they don't, that should be a red flag.
Right. Are you done with this slide?
Yeah.
Okay. See, I have a very important role. I feel you need me.
Okay. Sorry.
Okay.
So jump in anytime.
No,
So,
I am. This is your thing. You built this. You definitely are giving a lot of good information. I appreciate it.
okay. So assessment and identification of human trafficking victims. Like, we're never going to get it 100% right. We're never going to get it done, and we're never going to get it right. But we can start. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't start. And people I think that when you recognize that, oh, I'm up to bat, it's me they're asking me to identify. When you assume that responsibility for caring for your patient, then you're much more apt to be hopeful. And I think it isn't saying assessment and identification isn't grabbing a clipboard, writing furiously and doing some type of professional assessment. It's being aware, being culturally aware, understanding your patient, taking the time to observe, and knowing some things that may help you as potential, not absolute, but potential indicators of if someone is being trafficked. And there are the National Human Trafficking Resource Center. They have 3 assessment categories that are observable. Some things aren't, but some things are. There are potential indicators of human trafficking in general, indications of sex trafficking, and indications of labor trafficking. And remember, we had 3 types of trafficking: the sexual, the labor, and the domestic. And they basically tie in the domestic with, I'm tying in the domestic with the labor for now, because they may not present with these types of indicators. But if we flip to the next slide, I think that'll help you understand what I mean. So the general indications when somebody comes to you, no matter where, normally in a clinic, most people will hit, like we said, they don't access, human trafficking victims don't access healthcare at the beginning. They're not going for their routine checkups. They're not going for a ward. They're not developing a medical home. They don't have a relationship with the provider. If anything, they may jump from place to place. But when they do hit the healthcare environment, it's usually in a clinic or in an emergency room or an urgent care. Most likely, I think maybe an emergency room. But they don't come alone. The general indication is that they're brought by someone that supervises the visits and who refuses to leave the patient. The person usually speaks for the patient and interprets and coaches the patient, and they appear to be controlling them in some way by speaking to them or having their documents. Another red flag is that the patient has no identification on them, or that they seem fearful or make a little eye contact. And of course, like we all have learned in healthcare, cultural competence. Some people are more likely to give eye contact. There are some cultures that don't give eye contact. And that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the whole packet, what you're observing. Is somebody speaking for the person? Is the person looking down? Are they not speaking for themselves? Does someone appear to be controlling them? And then there's also kind of like a lot of missing pieces in the description of what happened. Normally when someone goes to the ER, if anyone's ever worked in an emergency room, and I have, people tell the story. They really tell you every nuanced detail of how this happened. And that's something I think that is absent in a trafficking victim. The story's not there, or it's scattered, or it doesn't make sense, or one person's saying it just doesn't make any sense. And so that's where the clinical presentation does not match the narrative, meaning that if they are battered or bruised and someone's saying, well, they fell down the steps, but by your own assessment, you're thinking that that doesn't seem possible to me. It doesn't, the injuries are too random. So that's where you would use your clinical skills to say, and your intuition to say, no, it doesn't mean that you're judge and jury. All we're asking you to do is to elevate it to the next level.
And I think a lot of the people that are taking this class, they work in healthcare right now. At this point in time, they work in long-term care, but in the future, they may work in a clinic or an emergency room or some other place, like you said, or even just out and about in the world.
Right.
And I think the point of this is to give you the tools to be able to pick up on those things.
Right.
And a lot of people in long-term care are trained to identify abuse, neglect, and exploitation. We have separate classes and all that. So now it's like, well, there may be abuse, neglect, and exploitation, but that it could also indicate, like you said, human trafficking as well.
Yeah, and I do think that when someone feels safe, maybe in long-term care, and they know that they're safe, they're more likely to not admit to it, but be more receptive to your care. I think that one thing when first meeting a human trafficking victim, they may be resistant, and that would be a confusing point for you. That actually should be a general indication when someone doesn't seem to want your help. Okay, we'll flip to the next one.
Okay.
So the general indications is for anybody. And then, so the potential indicators of labor trafficking, if you would see them in your professional setting or even in your environment, would be someone having injuries from lack of PPE, which is personal protective equipment, meaning they're working manual labor and they don't seem to be provided with the tools that which OSHA and most reasonable and prudent employers would provide. And if the worker is required to live in employer housing and they have little or no pay, there are signs of abuse, they seem hungry or malnourished in manual labor. And another thing would be, when we go to the questions, some of the questions, I just wrote down a couple that you could ask makes them kind of give you a direct answer is, are you free to come and go from your house as you please when they're required to live in employer housing? That might be a nice thing. They're like, oh, that might be something totally okay that the employer wants someone to live there and gives them free housing. But if they're never allowed to leave and they don't have any rights to do so, that would imply concern. So, okay, let's flip to the next one. So the sex trafficking, of course, there are sex workers that are over 18. They are not coerced and they want to work in the sex industry. And that's something that some people that's hard for them to understand. Why would you want to do that? That's kind of like somebody being judgmental. That's not. But when a person is definitely sex trafficking, when a person is under 18 and works in the sex industry, and also a red flag would be, and all those other things we can pull in, being managed by someone, somebody speaking for you, all those umbrella indicators can be pulled into this. Branding tattoos like property, daddy's girl, tattoos that just really don't make sense in any level. And it seems to be suggestive that somebody owns them, like property of so-and-so or daddy's girl or something. Those are the tattoos that would raise alarms. Not tattoos in general, but tattoos that are suggestive of ownership. So inappropriate dress, either suggestive or not weather appropriate, and that would probably be for a younger person. And reports a high number of sexual partners and use of sexual language. And most of this, I believe, applies to much younger people. People that are talking about sexual things when they're very, very young should be a red flag of either abuse or trafficking. But that would be the potential indicators of sex trafficking. And then we can move on to 17.
Okay.
So the goal of the healthcare encounter. So far we've identified that it's a global and domestic concern, that it's everywhere, that it is not, that it can be any race, any sex, any sexual preference or whatever. It could be, you have to take your blinders off. It really could be anyone. So once you've learned that, and you've learned to at least increase your awareness of some of the indicators that may be red flags in your personal practice or your job, then the goal, what's the goal of your encounter? And every time we interface as healthcare providers with anyone, we have an opportunity to help. And I think that this Gallup poll had rated nurses as the #1 trusted profession for like 20 years in a row. And I don't know if they've been rated this year or not. I should have looked that up. But the only year they weren't rated #1 as the most trusted profession would be, I think the firefighters took it.
After 9/11, maybe, yeah.
Yes, yeah. So, I mean, it isn't that nurses are particular. I think we are trustworthy, but I think that it's really a general statement of healthcare providers, that people have a great deal of faith in nurses' aides, nurses. People tell them things that they'd never tell anyone else, and that they actually trust that they will help, because it is a caring profession. Like, we all came into this profession to provide care. I mean, it's the caring profession. So I think that the goal, of course, of the encounter is to provide the best care as possible for the person, and to meet, of course, their immediate physical and medical needs, to keep them safe, and at the very minimum, to provide them resources if they don't want to accept any help. There's always something we can do. Sometimes I often think that we plant seeds, and sometimes we don't see what grows from our seeds, and sometimes we do. But every time we have an encounter with a patient, we have a chance to plant some type of seed, like we will help you. They may not come back. They may not take your help today. They may not take your help tomorrow. They may take somebody's help in a week or a month. So I really feel that our goal should always be trusting, empathetic, try to provide good medical care, good direction, to try to keep them safe if they accept it. And if not, at least give them some type of roadmap to help, either by providing a number or a human trafficking hotline. That would be our goal.
That's great advice.
So asking questions in a non-threatening way. Remember, we already said that anybody that's human trafficked is not walking in by themselves. If they are, they could. Maybe they escape. Maybe, I mean, most of them aren't. So you have to ask your questions in a non-threatening way. And I think that the most challenging thing would be to get the person alone. Now, every hospital healthcare, I think that at least in America, we have access to interpreters. It's just part of healthcare now. And that there should be healthcare or access to them in most languages. And if not, they could get a tele-interpreter. But to get the person alone without arousing the alarm of the trafficker is probably very challenging. And most of the time you would just say, it's our policy, we need to interview, we need to check her out by herself. Can you wait here? We have a no cell phone policy here. Something like that to get this person, this man, woman, child, away from them, and then be able to ask some just screening questions. And I pulled a couple of them off, and this is the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services campaign to rescue and restore victims of human trafficking. So, and they make sense. Can you come and go as you please? Can you leave your home? And it doesn't really arouse, they're asking specific questions, but they're not saying, are you being human trafficked? Or you're not kind of inundating them with fear. You're kind of like saying, oh, can you come and where do you live?
Let their guard down answering these questions possibly.
Yeah. And then sometimes you have to ask, like with the suicide, anyone that works in healthcare, you know that you don't beat around the bush with suicide questions. You ask, do you want to kill yourself? And I mean, that is such a difficult thing to learn how to ask somebody, but actually very important. So when you do ask your questions, make sure that you feel confident with them. Have you been physically harmed? Has anyone threatened your family? If they are, once you get a couple questions that they're comfortable with answering, then you can go in and just ask very directly. Some things you can do, are there locks on the doors and windows? Do you have permission to eat? I mean, that is a big question. Like you could pick one or two of them. And I like, do you have to ask permission to eat, to go out, or to go to the bathroom? I think that if somebody said, yes, I do, that should be that should elicit a ton of other questions. But those are some ways to ask the question in a non-threatening way.
Those are great.
Questions aren't really helpful sometimes. You can start and say, can you come and go as you please? And they'll say yes or no. And then you could say, oh, can you help me understand that? Like, and then you could get more information from them.
Yeah, where do you eat and sleep?
Yeah. Like, what does it look like? And then they'll say, I sleep with 14 other people, you know.
Mm-hmm.
That should be a red flag. So trauma-informed caring for human trafficking victims. Trauma-informed care should be just a part of any care interaction that you have with any patient, really with anybody. And of course, you want to learn not to re-traumatize them, try to empower them. And when you work with trauma-informed care, or if you understand how that works, it does promote healing and recovery. And I always learned when I was there's a lot of nursing theorists, you kind of pick one that you like. And but one that I liked had always said, the patient begins to heal when they feel heard. And I always thought if I had a personal mantra that I based my personal practice on, it would be to hear the patient. Like I wanted to always hear their experience in their own words, because it always fine-tuned my care to be as excellent as it could be. And I think that when these people don't really have a voice, so they can't be heard, and sometimes their voice is our voice, but we have to gain their trust in order to be able to begin helping them find their voice. And it's a very, I think it's very challenging. And these are not, sometimes the people that show up aren't, I mean, they're dirty, they might stink, they might have STDs, and they're not typically people that the people will want to spend any time in the room with. Sometimes they might be abrasive, they might be hostile, but those are the people that need trauma-informed caring the most sometimes. So I would ask people to think about that as a human being.
Yeah, if they looked homeless and they...
Yeah, because if they do, or like they're not all coming pristine and, you know,
right,
not like a Hallmark movie. It's actually, and yeah. So I do think that it's easy to put words and saying, oh yeah, I will be all that, but it's harder to actually implement these things with hostile, or you're afraid of the person yourself. But I do think in your organization, there should be, I mean, in a hospital setting, it would be easier to get support. If you would see this, out in the community or somewhere else, or maybe in a smaller place of employment, it might be more difficult, but you could still be empathetic. You could still try to provide some guidance. You could still report it if you see it. And even if you didn't, if you just reported it, if you thought you were concerned about it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I
Next
probably went too long on that slide. Sorry.
Okay.
So here's the challenge. These people reject their help. They're terrified. We already went through this. Stockholm syndrome. They're fearful. They don't have their papers. They're afraid of deportation. I mean, there's a whole litany of things that might make them like, no. So the minimum that you can do as a healthcare worker is to provide resources when they're ready for help. And you're probably not going to give them a flyer because they already have this manager or whatever they call it there to control them. They're not going to take a flyer from you. So sometimes when you're separated, you could possibly maybe write on some type of lab script the number in different places and tell them that was the number, or you could coach them to memorize it. It's probably not a good idea, but if that's the only resource you have, you could do that. Trying to get them to understand that there is help and that there are hotlines. There's the National Human Trafficking Resource Hotline. That there are people to help. If you could just plant that seed, then those numbers, they have them on billboards everywhere. Maybe they could find that or run and get help. Just planting the seed that there is help on the other side might be the most you can do. Mm-hmm. Something. I think also
like they might feel helpless, but
they definitely are.
Letting them know that there's a lot of support if they need it.
Yeah, it's really hard. On the other side of fear, there would be a lot of support. I just really feel that it's the fear component, which is, I guess it's all of our problems. None of us find it easy to get on the other side of fear, but these people, their dignity has been stolen, their cash has been stolen, their identification cards have been stolen from their life in some regards, as they knew it. They're depressed, they're disenfranchised, they're dependent, and they need help. And so as healthcare providers, we may not be able to convince them, but we can upgrade ourselves and our efforts to learn how to identify people, to be very well versed in how to ask those questions that need asked, how to be an advocate for them, how to report it if it needs reporting. Like, we can all be a part of the solution, even if the individual in front of us rejects our help at that time. That's what I think is the minimum we could do. We talked about all these things about why they may not seek help. And I think we've gone through all of those. And guilt and shame was one thing we didn't talk about, but I mean, I think
a lot of guilt and shame. And they probably feel like they're responsible for something.
They may have felt responsible for it, but also I think that people who exert power or control over people debase them in some way and make them feel meaningless and without value. And when they don't feel like their life has value, then they're not really going to advocate for themselves.
Mm-hmm. And the lack of
No, they're just victims in so many ways. They really are. Like, they're physically, so many things have been stolen from them. And also respect from society sometimes, because I think society sometimes, see them as homeless, mentally ill, mm-hmm. not worth it. And that's something that we can work on as healthcare providers, changing that.
And then a lack of understanding of the U.S. healthcare system?
Sure. I think, like, if you think about, if they come from other countries, then their point of reference may be their own healthcare system where, they didn't understand. They don't understand that the social service system that's in place in this country. They think that they'll just get turned in to somebody else. Or they may not understand that help is available. If you felt that your situation, no one could help, or that it's fixable, like if somebody's depressed, it's very hard to convince someone that the help is available, that you can be different, that it is treatable. Not always the way you want it to be, and sometimes it's a long process, but there are things they can try. But if they started out with the belief that this isn't fixable, then, or there's nothing in the healthcare system that will work for them, then that's a problem.
If they try, and it might make it worse if the situation doesn't resolve itself.
Right.
So organizations that promote human trafficking awareness.
Yeah, I need bifocals for this. I did it myself. So HEAL, there's a HEAL, the acronym HEAL, Health Education Advocacy and Linkage. There's Polaris, which is the website you and I reviewed earlier, which was amazing. There is the National Human Trafficking Hotline and Be Free text line. So it's 24/7. It connects human trafficking victims to resources. All the calls are confidential, and it can be used. I like this because it can be used by either a trafficking victim or a concerned citizen. So you can actually call your concerns if you think someone's being trafficked. And I'm not sure how that plays out, like how they would know or how that gets reported, how it gets investigated. But at least you can call and report your concerns. There's a human trafficking, I should have linked those, I apologize for that. Human Trafficking Knowledge Portal, the Traffic Victims Assistance Program.
We'll put links in the course. I'll build links underneath.
Okay.
Yep.
So those are organizations that promote education on human trafficking. And I really like the Polaris one.
Yeah, we'll jump over to that. I know we're trying to meet our 50 minutes. We've probably gone a little over on that.
Oh, sorry.
No.
So I know that when I always like my own personal philosophy of nursing is to zoom in and zoom out. And what I can do in this minute, what can I do on the first ripple? Like every action you take has an immediate ripple action, and then it kind of ripples out. But I often think, so I can't do anything about human trafficking, and I don't see many kids that are human trafficked in my personal work. But I do see kids that aren't. And so my role in healthcare may be to learn the tips from, I'm just giving this as an example that I pulled from one of those sites for kids. So maybe in pediatric offices, maybe they should be screening or asking questions or teaching, like, how are you groomed? How do people find you? By your online presence. And there are certain things that you could help to educate the kids in your life or kids that you know. Educate yourself. Don't accept friend requests from people you don't know. All the things your mother told you. Be aware of how traffickers recruit people and stay aware. Don't reveal too much of yourself online. I mean, a week or a month doesn't go past, in at least where I live, where some girl takes a bus and goes somewhere to meet a man.
Yeah.
And you think, how does that happen? How do they not know? But if we pull back, how do people become trafficked? First of all, when we go back to the first or second or third slide, and we looked at what are some things that you see of a trafficking victim? Depression, worthlessness, anxiety, maybe cutting. Some of these kids in our society are already disenfranchised. They're already doing that. They already feel vulnerable. They've started there. They're the ones that are susceptible to being groomed. And those kids aren't kids that are from Mexico or Colombia or France or Ireland. Kids in our community, kids that feel those emotions. So they're likely to be groomed, not likely, but they're
Advantage of, yeah.
it. And I think that a lot of times, like we think, a lot of kids are even more savvy today. My own children are more savvy than I am with a computer. So for me to be teaching them about the computer, like they're like, I know that. And then you feel dumb. But adults probably don't know, aren't up to speed with everything that's happening, or how people are very try to get to your kids. So it would be like a community education project on how you might just talk to a kid in the neighborhood, like, hey, don't, how do you do that online if they're in your office or you know them? These were some things that I picked that I thought were good tips for just kids that haven't been trafficked, but maybe are vulnerable. And I think any child is vulnerable, really.
Yeah.
So I guess I just kind of always like to end with a call to action and maybe give people, if I was going to spend an hour, if anybody's, I really hope that you leave and stay informed. And if you did listen to the entire webinar, that you have changed your perspective of what a human trafficking victim may look like. That you understand the difference between being smuggled and human trafficked, and that somebody can be a victim of human trafficking and being forced labor. They don't have to be sex workers. That's a very common misconception, that these people, it's a public health issue in that they don't get routine care, that they have forced abortions, and that they have STDs, and they're sick and malnourished, and that they need our help. And you could start, if you didn't know, to be an advocate for training and education, like I said, with the example of if you worked in a pediatrician's office, to advocate for screening. Like they now screen for opiate use in pediatrics now. And to understand how to ask the questions, what are some of the risks, the potential risk indicators like we outlined, and just to increase your awareness and to know how to report that, as we said, and you could report it as a concerned citizen, you could report it through your facility program, and just be an active part of the solution through education and advocacy.
I think we're probably over our hour here. So
well, this is the last thing is probably, this is the human trafficking. They can text. Now remember, why would you want to text? Because they can't talk. If they had access to a phone, they're hiding and they're trying to get a call. So the texting would be very helpful to them. Also, if they're hidden somewhere with bad cell phone service, texts often go, they actually have more range than a telephone.
They have live chat.
200 languages. So it's a beginning. There's an infrastructure in place to help people, but we are the frontline providers where we're actually going to see them. I mean, they're not coming out in many places where we have the opportunity to separate them from their manager, handler. So healthcare is just a real opportunity to try to help these people.
Yep. And here's the Polaris website we were talking about. It's a nonprofit. And it's about, bringing this into focus in healthcare. And they have some really great bullet points here. I'm just going to go through them quickly.
Okay.
You can also visit the website and take a look at it. But traffickers prey on individuals with health vulnerabilities, and such as physical disabilities, mental health diagnosis, substance use concerns, or intellectual developmental disabilities. So you touched on all that. That's nothing new, right?
Well, I don't know if I really highlighted the intellectual developmental disability.
Okay.
I think it's important to know that they are victims as well.
Right.
I don't know if I actually pulled that out as that's important.
Victims' access to healthcare. Most trafficking victims will have contact with healthcare during their exploitation, including at primary care, reproductive health clinics, medical specialties, mental health, substance use disorder treatment, or most often emergency departments. So we covered that.
Right.
Healthcare in trafficking operations. Labor trafficking victims are found not only among patients, but within healthcare workforce in residential care facilities, occupational therapy, or in-home caregiving. Foreign victims are often tricked with misleading visa contracts, indebted, and threatened if they speak up. Women from the Philippines are disproportionately affected. Human trafficking and illicit drug economy fueling the public health issues. So I thought that was interesting. That
Yeah.
in-home caregiving.
Yeah, I thought maybe that would maybe be the third, the domestic servitude.
Yep.
Yeah. I'd like to look up statistics on that as well.
Healthcare as a means of control. Many trafficking victims are in need of medical attention while being trafficked. However, some traffickers may fully deny or restrict access to healthcare. When victims are allowed to access health services, their trafficker may closely monitor them. We touched on that. And yeah, I think that these are all points that you covered, but it's another resource I wanted to cover. And I know we're over our time, so I'm going to have to try to figure out how to pare this down and get it within a 1-hour webinar. But Diane, this was a great presentation. I thank you so much for your time. And
I hope that somebody has an aha moment or changes their perspective just a little bit to help somebody.
I think that, yeah, and your employer is having you take this training, and you're going to be able to take it on through your life. And hopefully that's how we can build an awareness, is just by training and educating as many people as possible. So,
I agree.
Well, thank you. And I'm trying to figure out how to stop the video. Thanks, Diane. Have a great day. And
hey, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Okay, Diane, I stopped the video. Thank you. That was great. I don't even know how long it was. So I'll have to see if I can turn down maybe just the intro, or maybe I'll cut off the end there. So how do you think?
I'm sure we'll get better at it.
Yeah. How do you think it went for you?
Oh, it was, I mean, I love to talk about things. I'm hoping that I'm hoping that I didn't look like an angel.
We'll work on lighting on your face.
Okay. Yeah.
You're a little dark.
Okay. So, yeah, just so you think it turned out okay and I didn't ramble or anything.
No, it was good. We just, we'll have to, we'll come up with a plan to meet the 50-minute timing next time. That's all. But it's hard to find out ahead of time.
All right. Well, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the next topic, I know for sure there's some sort of social competency, or, you talked about that at one point. Cultural competency.
Yes.
I'd love to do that one as a subject if you'd like to.
Oh, okay. I love that subject.
Or another good one would be LGBTQ in long-term.
Oh, I just did a whole thing on that. I love that subject, particularly accessing healthcare through the years.
Yeah, and in long-term care, there's definitely like people that are LGBTQ would be more ashamed or more reserved. Right. And also the healthcare workers and how they deal with it.
Right.
Either one of those subjects, whatever you want to do. Okay,
perfect. When do you want it done?
As soon as you can come up with them, I'm okay with doing them. So if you want to towards next week.
I'll start working on them then. Perfect.
Okay. All right, Diane.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Yeah.